All right, so thank you to all of you intrepid souls who are sticking with us here to the end. Really appreciate it. I'm sure our great panel here appreciates it as well. This is actually a really important panel, so I'm glad that you stayed. All of the work that we're doing on fire-based exchange and notifications and image exchange is hugely important, and we're looking forward to a lot of progress on that in 2020. There's an awful lot that's going on right now, however, in supporting production exchange and actual patient care related to our query-based document exchange implementation guide. And our next panel is going to address the enhancements that we're working on for that implementation guide. So with that, I'll turn it over again to Chris Dickerson.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thanks. So it's me again. For better or worse, I'm who you're stuck with. So we made a couple of mentions of updates to the implementation guide. As many of you probably know, the implementation guide is kind of one of the framework documents. So that includes the CCA, the IG, and a couple of others that's all available on the website. But if you're in this room, you probably already know what it is. We continually update the implementation guide based on community demands, based on changing policy landscapes, things that we think that we'll just need to do to prepare for the future. And in that sort of effort, we convene work groups, as always. So this is our implementation guide updates work group. Our panel kind of represents a lot of the interested stakeholders in the particular updates, as well as just being generally an expert in everything that we do. First, let me just introduce everybody. You have Stephen Lane. So Dr. Lane, as you all know, is from Sutter. He's a practicing primary care physician and clinical informaticist, and he serves as the clinical informatics director for privacy, information security, and interoperability for Sutter. In addition to that, not to say that it's like the least of all of his credentials, he's also on the Sequoia board and the chair of the steering committee. We also have Jennifer Blumenthal. She's the co-founder and CEO of OneRecord, and they have been active live participants in Carequality forever. Is it forever? Yeah, it's probably forever. So we also have Matt Becker from Epic. He's spent 12 years at Epic and is an interoperability lead for them. So with that, let's go a little bit into these slides. As painful as it may be to subject you to more slides, I'm going to have to do it. So quick overview. We're going to go through history, just like we did last panel. We'll talk about patient requests, document content, and enhanced statistics reporting, along with some content testing. And I'm sure that's saved for the last because I know that'll generate some questions. So quick look at the history. So as I mentioned, the implementation guide is always getting updated. We're always looking at what we can do next to make that guide support interoperability and also our community better. So the initial guide, version 1.0, came out in 2015. We started the update process in 2017, but that 2015 guide, that had a lot in it. It laid the groundwork for document exchange, defined roles within the use case, introduced non-discrimination principles of trust. Those fundamental pieces in that initial IG, we still see that in version 2.0, but we're also seeing it in push. We're seeing it in fire. These things work, and we're trying to keep them because they're kind of the character of Carequality. It's kind of our philosophy and approach to exchange. So, as I mentioned, update cycle started in 2017. Generally, it takes about a year to bake one of these updates. Between working in the work groups themselves, so working on that language, getting an idea of what we need to add, then bringing it to our advisory council, then to the steering committee, and then finally for open comment from the community. In years past, the updates work groups have been a little bit more closed. Now they're open, just like our other work groups. So if you see anything through this presentation and you think to yourself, I can fix that, or I want to do something about a particular policy item, feel free to join. We are pretty late in the process now, I will admit, but there will be a public comment period after steering committee review either way. So pick your time to make a comment, but you can always email me too. So version 1.1 was our update in 2018. It added patient request and coverage determination, permitted purposes, and it introduced access policy assertions, which is a really cool mechanism to communicate a little bit more than just your permitted purpose and give the query responder some idea of your intent, what you already have as far as consents, things like that. Version 2.0, we've updated non-prod testing. We've enhanced statistics reporting, document content, validation and testing, and we've added updates to payment, healthcare operations, and patient request permitted purposes. So to start off the conversation with patient request, I'm going to hand it off to Jen.
How many people are familiar with patient requests in IG? How many people respond to patient requests in the IG? Okay, so that is a problem. So for patient requests, this, like Chris said, has been live on the network. I think the draft was in 2017, and then the final version was 2018. So this allows you as individuals to access the network and pull your data through a participating implementer. Right now, there's been a really low adoption rate for responding to this request, so we haven't seen that much action on the network in regards to this. But with the new implementation guide, there are some updates, and those are what we're going to go over next. I'm supposed to click the slide, sorry. Okay, so that's what I was just talking about. So there was a work group that looked at patient requests, and that was in 2017, and what we can do to improve that. So the version 2 of the implementation guide includes a series of additions based on patient request work group conclusions. Implementers that initiate queries for this permitted purpose of use must attest to the Caring Code of Conduct. So just a little background. The Caring Code is another alliance. There was a representative here, but I think he's already left. And this has been, they've been working on this for a while. There's multiple iterations of it. It basically calls for a standard code of how app developers should be cooperative when they're engaging on networks, app ecosystems, just generally within the healthcare space. I think its plan is to be updated regularly when needed, but we're asking now for any member and implementer to attest to the code. It really calls for transparency and education and doing the right thing by the consumer, especially when you're using this request mechanism. I think that it's a good addition, and I think it's nice that it's being adopted across the healthcare ecosystem. So a lot of the EHR vendors are asking for this to be attested to as well. The VA developer API is asking for this. So I think having the same code of conduct across healthcare is going to be helpful for people understanding as new entrants into the space. So we were already talking about the app developers, so that's what this is for. Sorry. Okay, so this one is the big update for the next version. So to support patient requests, payment, and healthcare organizations. So similar to V1.1, query responders are encouraged but not required to respond to patient requests. Queries in V.2, implementers support the responder must provide support to enable their CCs to honor queries for payment requests, patient requests, and healthcare operations. There are 3 points detailed here. Ensure that their network agreements or other relevant contractual terms are compatible with CCs honoring queries for their permitted purposes. Provide CCs with the ability to configure their system through readily accessible systems settings to honor such queries, provide CCs wishing to honor such queries with reasonable technical operational support in context of honoring such queries, consistent with the implementer's support for CCs in context of honoring queries for permitted purposes of treatment. I really hope I read that all correctly. What's important to know is when the implementation guide goes into its final version, is adopted, it's 6 weeks.
6 months.
Oh no, 6 months after the adoption date, you should be able to essentially be able to support this functionality. This is a big step forward for patient access and for consumer apps or patients just on the network. And we assume, I can't press the right button, that the 2020 roadmap will align with everything that's been discussed over the past few days regarding TEFCA and any policy changes. So there will probably be additional updates to the IG to support patient access. And that's it.
It's one thing really quickly. It's important to mention that we are always looking at national policy and how that affects our implementation guides. So while our normal cycle is kind of once a year, when something big happens, we do have to respond, obviously. So we expect to have a full review of all of our policies, this included. And we're hoping that by doing what we're doing now, we're going to be more in line with future policy. So that's a little bit less work we have to do on the back end later.
I think also Carequality is set up for this right now, and they can lead the way infrastructurally to give patients access over networks as opposed to other environments that we discussed earlier, so I'm not going to go into detail right now.
Well, I'm very excited that, that this is coming. I think being able to respond to patient queries will be a good thing for our patients and our communities, and looking forward to working with our vendor to put that into place.
Just to clarify one thing, there are implementers who do respond to patient requests right now. It's not everyone. There's just a very low adoption rate.
So I'm going to talk about document content. I was very much involved in the document content work group that will be discussing the output of that group. Essentially, this started in the fall of 2017 when we had independent work groups within the Carequality community and the Commonwealth community that were really struggling with document content issues. And the main issues that were being addressed were these large documents, patient summary documents, oftentimes that didn't include clinical notes, which for clinicians are incredibly important. For many, if not most of the vendors, there was no access to encounter-specific documents. And those of us who have enjoyed the benefit of encounter-level documents have really seen the critical value that comes from being able to assemble those in a single longitudinal view of the patient's record. And people are always complaining about these huge CCDs, and you can't find the data that you need. And so this was what the challenge that we were trying to address, as well as the problem of document versioning and how to get the latest version of a document. So in fall of 17, Commonwealth and Carequality decided to merge their two work groups. This included a group of subject matter experts from across both of those communities that included a number of clinicians. Many of us have been here at the meeting this week and really provided a lot of input to that effort. So by May of 18, we pushed out the first version of a white paper about how we felt these documents should go forward. And then we received a lot of feedback, and then we put together a second version that was published earlier this year. And I'll just quickly review what were kind of the main components of that. We discussed this last year, but probably not everyone was here last year. So the top line was the support for encounter summaries, in addition to patient-level summary documents, the desire for every vendor to be able to develop and deliver encounter summary documents, that these should be based on the progress note template for ambulatory encounters and for the discharge summary CCDA template for inpatient visits, that these encounter-level documents should include the clinical notes, the narrative clinical information, and the document did identify the 7 most common note types based on work that had been done by Argonaut and by the VA. that these encounter summary documents should include the relevant discrete data at the time of that encounter. So we don't want to know what's on the med list today, but we want to know what was on the med list then at the time of that encounter, and that information should be current as of that encounter date. That really is what belongs inside those encounter summary documents. There were also specifications of section time range observations for each of the sections inside those documents, because vendors seem to do different things with the section time ranges, which confuses end users when they get those. And when a query for a period of time is received, I want all the data for January through November of 2019, that you would include in the response all of the encounter level documents for that period of time. So that, plus some general guidelines for what were called smart senders and resilient receivers, that was the main content of that white paper that was published. So again, to summarize the updates that occurred in the second version, there was this desire to specify the detailed contents that's inside those encounter summaries, as I mentioned, problems, allergies, medications, and immunizations that were relevant to or reviewed at that encounter. The specification and the honoring of time parameters in the query, and really additional information to try to make that those documents as usable as possible with a number of examples, et cetera. So we think that this is going to really make a large difference. Now that this has been finalized, we've presented it now 2 years in a row here, and we believe that really the best way to move this forward is to really encourage, push, require all of the vendors to implement the changes. And again, when this new implementation guide comes out and becomes a requirement, that will really drive us forward on this path. Because what we learned is that if we simply rely on policy requirements, that's not getting us where we need to go. We're also adding to this a testing component where we're going to be able to look and see specifically what are the capabilities of each of the implementers with regard to meeting the requirements that have been laid out here. And again, we still believe that the combined forces of Carequality and its implementers, including Commonwealth and now soon eHealth Exchange, is really the correct forum to move this forward, whether we're talking about document content, whether we're talking about quality of the data that's contained in those documents. We think that this is the appropriate national forum to bring together the stakeholders to develop and really evolve these guidelines going forward. And I also want to point out, how many of you have ever been to a panel discussion where all of the panelists were wearing pink socks? Right? Has this ever happened? I hope somebody picked that up, right?
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah, hide yourself.
My eyes are up here.
So I think one thing that we've done through Carequality, and we've done a good job of, is understanding that you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think some of the enhanced statistics that are coming are a good thing in terms of making sure we take that next step in what we're actually doing to measure the health of the network. So right now, as you know, we send out requests to make sure that we get all the statistics for exchanges every month, and we report that to Carequality, and people like Stephen and others do a good job of reporting that back to you in terms of how we're doing. So in IG 2.0, what we're also adding is that there's going to be a specific number of documents retrieved with query response times. And like the fire work group pointed out earlier, this is not an SLA by any means. But at the same time, you can't manage what you don't measure, so we should start measuring it and figuring out where we need to start having discussions. So again, the advantages are it's just you satisfy the ongoing validation just by reporting these statistics, but it enables Carequality and the rest of us to look broad level at what's happening in the community, understand where we might need to improve, and then make those improvements. So content testing, I know we've kind of skidded around this a little bit, but it is part of version 2.0. I think the important thing here is that we intentionally decoupled the idea of the policy side of content testing with how we're going to do it. As Chris showed earlier, each version of the IG takes about 2 years to come out, and we don't want to spend another 2 years kind of legislating how we're going to do this content testing. We just know we want to do it. There's discussions underway in how we're going to do this in the future, but what you need to know about the content testing inside the IG is that folks need to do it. There are specific parameters that I'll get into on how we're going to do it, but at the same time, we're not legislating yet what is actually going to happen. So there is this problem in content testing that not all implementers actually create the content that they're sharing. So we have this idea of what's called a content creator. And what that does is enables us to understand who's responsible for creating that content and then being able to test off of that. So a content creator is essentially any implementer who maintains the software to generate documents. So I come from Epic, and in an Epic world, we write the code that actually generates the documents, so that you can understand that we are the content creators in that case. And then there's also intermediaries, like Commonwealth and No2, that are the bridge between their community, their CCs, and you. And so we made sure to make special rules to make sure that we can test that content, but understand the nuance of that as well. So we have many cases like No2 and Commonwealth where they don't create the content, but what they do is they have agreements with the folks like Matrix Care, Meditech, that actually create the content. And so we use the term service providers for that in order to make sure that we have a category so that we can actually test their content. So there also exists in the community this idea of service providers that don't have direct relationships with their content creators. I know a lot of you HIEs in the room don't have direct relationships with everybody you're pulling data from and then resharing that data. And so we wanted to make sure to make an exception in that case for the folks that don't really have that level of control, but provide this first step in making sure across the community for the folks that can have that control over their data, that folks understand that that needs to be tested. We intentionally left a bunch of time for questions because I know these are pretty meaty updates. So head up to a microphone and ask away.
Hello.
Hello. So my question goes back to, Jennifer, what you were talking about with the, related to the permitted purposes and what people would accept. We're also running into an issue with very few people accepting the patient request. And so I guess I was trying to quickly understand the slide. So it sounded like what I saw is that if you are responding to queries that you would then have to, in the new implementation guide or proposed, that you would have to respond to additional purposes. So am I getting that right, or?
So what the updates are right now are you are not required to respond. The new update is requiring support for those use cases. So it is still not a requirement for any implementer on the network to respond to the request, but they are required to support those use cases, which is what's going to be eventually released in the final version. But as Matt was saying, I think that the way things are going is that there's probably going to be faster iterations on the implementation guide. So what we see here right now is what's going to be adopted in 2020, I guess, but there might be more versions coming in 2020.
So are you hopeful personally that
Yes.
you'll see more? Okay.
So, I'll just use this for a moment. I think that I've heard people express their concerns about authentication, ID proofing. Can we trust these people on the network? I think that the additions to the implementation guide are really great. I don't think we've done enough work for patient access. I think it needs to go a lot further, so that's why I'm hoping we can move faster through implementation guides or putting amendments into them and having essentially the whole community accept them. Right now, to be able to query out and nobody responds unless you specifically know the implementer who's going to respond is very disappointing, especially for how much time and energy I think we all put into this. I think that there's a lot of value for the current architecture for consumers to access their data through it. You know, there are limitations right now with the fire spec and what resources are available. And I think for people who are really dealing with serious situations, there is a lot of value to pull in a full CCDA and see a lot more than the specific resources. I think also Carequality offers the environment. It's not just, we go through the application process, the testing process. Now we're going to test the care and code, which is supposed to essentially bring transparency to us as organizations, but also transparency to our participants who are the consumers. It's a direct-to-consumer code, essentially. I think that it's a call to action for all implementers who currently are not responding to patient requests to start thinking about, well, how can we start responding to the ones who are on the network and improving this before it's actually mandatory, I think, sorry Dave Castle, that we do respond to patient requests. I think this is the moment right now. You know, everybody's prepping their fire servers, they're adjusting their policies. If you want to test with people on the network who've already gone through everything and it's not a rush to the front door, this is the moment to do it, and then we can learn something for the next version of the implementation guide.
Also, I think it's worth pointing out that many of the vendors already allow patients to download a CCD. I mean, my patients can come onto our portal and download their CCD. The difference is that they could go onto your app and authenticate through you and then come in that way, which I think makes it much more convenient for a patient, especially who's receiving care at multiple organizations. Again, Fire is starting to do this as well, which is exciting, but it's not the same as the CCD.
I also think the questions that they're asking in the Fire work groups and even content standards works groups, we'll see fall into the patient use case, because we have to think about improving authentication. And also, I do hope there's a point where it is bidirectional, where we can have a patient essentially send information out and send it to, you know, their designated health system that's on the network.
So hi, Paul Matthews. Quick sort of practical question. You talked about a timeline from the implementation guide, I think it's the 2.0 release, giving 6 months in which to be able to implement that timeline.
I think it's 6 weeks from the actual, it goes into effect after, and then 6 months to support the new requirements.
Yes.
So you have 6 months to support, oh no, I'm not speaking correctly, I don't know.
Hey, Dave.
I'm reading the crypt notes.
Good question. There are sort of two timelines that are relevant. There's a timeline for when the steering committee adopts the next version of the implementation guide as a Carequality element, and when that Carequality element actually goes into effect. So that time period is roughly on the order of 60 to 90 days. There are some other waiting periods in there that we will try to do somewhat simultaneously with the steering committee's review. So there's that initial 90-day process. Then the implementation guide language itself has a waiting period, which I believe is 6 months. I could be wrong.
6 months.
For when the requirements to support at the implementer level your CCs who wish to respond to queries for these various purposes. There's a 6-month period there for before that becomes the actual requirement that would be enforced.
So from a distributed solution, Epic, how would they implement that from a pragmatic level inside of each single organization within a 6-month time frame, when most organizations don't accept the code and implement it more frequently than 6 months?
Very good question, and I think that hits on a point that I wasn't entirely certain if it was clear what we meant there by support. What we mean by support is not that every Epic customer needs to do anything. Okay. In fact, no Epic customer must do anything. What Epic would need to do in this example, and nothing specific to Epic here, is make sure that their contract terms do not forbid their customers from using the connectivity to do other purposes. And then also at a technical level, ensure that they have some capability, whether it's there automatically or they could flip a switch or something else, to allow a customer who wished to release It could just be literally the same data that they would have released to another provider for treatment purposes. If they're willing to do that, that there needs to be a capability within the system to allow that. So it's both the contract terms and whatever technical support may be necessary needs to be available. It does not necessarily need to be implemented, as Jennifer had said.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we're trying to remove every roadblock to clear the way. And that's really where we are at this point. Any other questions?
Actually, I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
So what is the convergence of the requirement to include clinical notes in the documents and patient access, from a perspective of open notes? Because today, across the country, we have inconsistent implementation of open notes where patients can go in and get the full text of their clinician's notes through a portal, for example. The way that my vendor does this today is when a patient goes and downloads a CCDA document through the portal, they get the same content that they can see in the portal. It's just packaged up into a CCDA format. But that's different than what we just described in terms of requiring the inclusion of clinical notes. So will patient access include clinical notes across the board? Will it only include clinical notes for those who have opted into open notes until such time that information blocking makes us all do that, or what?
Well, I think your last, almost in passing addition there, until information blocking makes us do all of that. My sense is, and I understand this is not the actual practice that is prevalent, but my sense is that if you're not doing open notes, that is potentially information blocking. That it is not abiding by the right of the patient to have access to their records. So from a Carequality standpoint, I would see the convergence there as perfectly in alignment with information blocking and the expectation that you would in fact be providing patients with access to their full records when the patient requests it.
Yeah, I think that goes back to an important point that Chris mentioned at the beginning of this, is that, when we have the implementation guide, making sure that when we know fully about information blocking, we're aligning as much as possible, just so we don't have to go down two different paths there is going to be pretty important.
I actually have a question that is not for the panel, but for the group. There would obviously be a great deal of discussion and vetting at the board level and the steering committee level. There are a couple of different angles on this for Carequality, but one of the things that we've tossed around a little is doing not a certification. I don't see Carequality as a certifying body, excuse me, but doing some sort of validation process at a deeper level than we would do as typically for the implementer applications. For patient apps that wished to be able to participate in Carequality. I do still have the sense that this tension that we haven't resolved as an industry between the very well-defined requirements under HIPAA for ensuring that you are keeping a patient's records secure and private and keeping that protected, it has not yet been fully reconciled with the right of access and the well-intentioned and very clear in spirit, but not necessarily as fleshed out in the details, rules around making sure that patients have access to their records. And so until there's some enforcement and a lot more detail that is institutionalized around the requirements to provide patient access, I think you're still going to have some of this hesitation and some of this tension that we see. One potential way that I think we could help with that is to really have a seal of approval, if you will. Again, not necessarily a certification in the formal sense, but some sort of additional vetting that would be done to look at, well, how are you doing patient identity proofing? What are your security practices? Actually taking a look at that for each of the patient apps that might participate in Carequality. Would that be helpful? Do people think that would be a useful thing for Carequality to investigate? And no promises on actually doing it, but would that be useful for us to investigate in more detail at a strategic level for something that we would do. Would that help to open some of the gates?
I personally think a seal of approval is a good idea. I also would suggest that the service implementers, so folks like SureScripts, like Know2, like Zen, who are helping onboard some of these smaller vendors to onboard them to Carequality, can also play a really important role. I know the vendor we work with, we walked them through the steps. This is the level of patient authentication that you must have. We were involved in the development that they had so that they don't even get a patient registered in their app unless the identity vetting has completed successfully. So, you know, I think we can play an important role in that process in helping identify kind of where we see the issues are for those vendors. And I think also keeping in mind that even though we might think that, oh, a vendor will just immediately, directly go, you know, spin up an engineer and write to FHIR, I think in reality what we're seeing as we work with vendors is that they don't even know how to do that, and that they tend to use, they like to use folks that can act as a gateway, if you will, to even what should be pretty easy API type connectivity, because they just don't have the expertise in-house. So I think, one, giving more guidance. I liked your idea of specifying on the patient identity certain services that meet that bar. I think that would be really good. Anything we can do to kind of simplify, give us a checkbox and help us walk these vendors through the process, I think would be really helpful. And because I want to drive adoption, so, you know, even if it's a little bit more work, I think, to me, what we need to get to is the point where people can feel like they can trust. And if we can do that, it's going to make a huge difference.
And Dave, if I can just comment, you know, Karen, of course, has the code of conduct. Their roadmap is to move toward testing and certification. At least that's my understanding. Ryan's not here to speak for himself. But I think that it would be nice if we don't duplicate that work, that if we can point to another certification or testing process, that would be more efficient.
If you break down the Karen code, I'm part of the Karen Alliance as well. I wasn't part of the structuring of that document, but I participate on the work groups. It's a lot of what you see pulled from all the other agencies, and it really is like a lot of it is about, you know, abiding by the rules of a framework, of a network, and then there's other parts that's very much about education and transparency. Like right now, how do we tell people who come onto OneRecord what Carequality is? I mean, it's a really hard, giant concept to describe, and how do you tell them about essentially, you know, data sharing and all of these kinds of things. There's a lot of small nuances to the Karen code that I think is probably a first step to introducing new members into the network, new consumer app members into the network. But there's a lot more that we can do to make everybody here comfortable, because really and truly, I don't think anybody's here to be bad actors, especially in this room.
Yeah, just briefly, I absolutely want to hear from Shana and Scott. You get to talk this time. To respond, I actually was part of the work group, and I participated as much as I could, which wasn't every time, but I was part of the work group that crafted the Karen Code of Conduct. I think it's a very useful document, but ultimately, you're still attesting to whether or not you actually adhere to it, and that's where actually diving into, well, what are you doing? When you said you do identity proofing, great. We could even contractually bind you to that, but how useful is that after the fact when something horrible has happened? Going in proactively and saying, show us how you're doing identity proofing. You know,
I think it's a good idea to do the proactive approach. There was a comment on the FHIR work group about thresholds, and I actually 100% agree with that. I think that I know very intimately how the ID proofing solutions work that I use. I can tell you that there's a lot of ways to create guide rails to make sure whatever solution is used it's properly being used, and it's something that people feel comfortable with. Like Mickey mentioned that Commonwealth is thinking about how they're going to essentially vet ID proofing solutions. I think there's a lot of, if we just focused on maybe that, what that needs to look like as an upgrade for the IG, I think it will take us a step closer to people being more comfortable, and then a further adoption of the use case.
Great.
So I'm kind of two minds. I like the concept of enabling apps to position on this, but a lot of consumer apps are not uniquely just trying to be aggregators of patient data. Ours in particular, it's about really supporting a whole range of things that have nothing to do with clinical data. And I also think that insofar as most people access, for the foreseeable future, their health information via the covered entities that they have a relationship with, and they have had to credential themselves for access to that, and then use those same credentials to then access their information for these apps. I worry that we create our own barrier to the development and deployment of consumer solutions that are more readily accessible and usable. And I've never understood why we can't also explore, at least make it an and, how people that have been authenticated through their multiple healthcare systems can't leverage those credentials in a way that allows them to not keep having to re-authenticate themselves through every app or means by which they're trying to manage their health.
Very, very good points. I think we could see how some of that authentication could conceivably work in the SOAP web services world. Certainly, as we look at the work that's going on in Carequality for fire, we would expect that to be supported. At the same time, I think that's a starting point. There are some, you only go so far, and I'm stating my personal opinion here, you only go so far with some of those OAuth flows. You do have to have an account that you've already authenticated with the particular system you're trying to query. You have to remember your login and password, which is a whole other question, even if you have such a thing. So there are some logistical challenges there that I think if we truly solve some of these problems of trust, we wouldn't have to worry about making you set up that account. That said, certainly as part of a transition period, I think that is going to remain important.
Gosh, it's nice. Get an opportunity to speak. So, really interesting set of subjects. I would like to just offer that, our organization, Direct Trust, has a lot of experience with this idea. First of all, from the standpoint of what happens when you don't have anything like this. So in the history of Direct Trust, in the absence of a Direct Trust framework, there was no exchange of substance because basically people were not comfortable with the other's practices. And so it was beyond, so that was what caused Direct Trust to exist, is Direct Trust exists because the ONC and others realized that, frankly, nothing would ever happen unless you put the right seal of approval, and it's not just an attestation or an assertion, it's an accreditation. Now, it does have to be lightweight enough because this industry, the app industry, is going to have to be it's going to have to be respectful for the kind of organizations these companies are. They're startups, they're relatively small, so it's not, Jennifer's wagging her head. I don't wag your head, sorry, that's wrong. So truly, though, this opportunity is I think, for the kinds of things that scalable trust could bring to the problem of solving the individual's problem. So they're not wanting to have multiple credentials. So the potential that those two things could be one thing, that I could have the organization vetted and their processes vetted, but also get the benefit of a portable credential in the process. I think that's actually a pretty exciting opportunity. But I think if you don't actually build a real trust framework around the technical, scalable trust aspects of this, it won't work. I don't think people will actually do the exchange until they have a confidence. Having watched that conversation happen at Commonwealth, where the hands went up in the room, how many of you think more care needs to be taken than what we just described? And all the hands went up. So the point is that somehow or another, we've got to provide the right level of comfort or exchange won't happen. And not just for the consumer apps. As we kind of expand to these, to the edge folks, the folks that are outside of traditional health information exchange, the home care settings, and the non-covered entities that are also offering aspects of supporting the patient in their care process. Those communications are going to be especially hard to enable without a trust framework that supports putting a stamp of approval on whatever they do.
Is Direct Trust looking at supporting a stamp of approval for apps?
We are. So we're actually in collaboration with ENAC on the subject to try and figure out what the right size model is. So ENAC has the privacy and security element. Today they do that piece for the HISPs. And we do the operational aspects and the identity proofing aspects. So that's the thinking about how we could do that. We already have. So I would posit that it's more than the identity proofing piece that you need to figure out. I mean, that's a very key part. But if that's done, if that's the only thing that's done, I think that it won't be enough. There's more that needs to be done around privacy and security. Has nothing to do with HIPAA, but it nonetheless has to do with adequate protection of health data, of EHI.
We could talk about the latter point over a beer sometime, but no, thank you. And we should talk about what you're planning to do.
Hi, I just want to maybe end this on a different note. Totally supportive of all the patient query. Humana, I personally worked on that code of conduct. Humana has signed it, and very excited about the work we're doing on patient query. But I'd like to thank the group because there are 2 other use cases that are now on the Carequality roadmap because of this implementation guide that I have personally been here for 2.5 years trying to champion. So I'd like to end this on thanking you for adding the payer payment and operations use cases to the world of Carequality, and it's a huge step, and thank you very much.
Yeah. And thank you for highlighting that. I think we did maybe lose a little bit of that in the focus on the patient side of it. So thank you. All right. With that, we're actually right at 12:50. Pretty good timing by everyone. So first off, thank you to our panel.